Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kaylin Nicholson.
And I'm Kshama Sawant. As the Israeli state's genocidal war on Gaza rages on, and the campus anti-war protest movement continues to fight against it, On Strike has consistently brought forward both analysis of the character of the war and what we think the next steps for the movement should be. We've explained what we believe it represents in the context of the new Cold War era and the Age of Disorder, and how there is a real threat of it leading to a wider war in the Middle East. We've spoken about what it will take to end the war, what it will take to end U.S. military funding to the Israeli state, and to end the decades-long brutal occupation. We've also brought conversations with guests about the anti-war movement, how it is linked with the presidential election, and the role of the labor movement in it. We've recently had left anti-war candidate Jill Stein and Cora Bergantinios Crespo, the outgoing president of UAW 4100, the Union of Postdoctoral Researchers at Columbia University and Mount Sinai Hospital. Today, we are thrilled to have as our guest anti-war journalist Chris Hedges. Many who are watching will already know Chris Hedges. Chris covered the first Persian Gulf War in the 1990s for the New York Times, where he refused to participate in the military pool system that restricted the movement of and reporting by journalists. He was arrested by the United States Army and had his press credentials revoked, but continued to defy the military restrictions to report outside the pool system. In 1991, Chris was appointed the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. In 1995, Chris was named the Balkan bureau chief for the New York Times. In 2003, Chris gave a commencement speech at the graduation ceremony for Rockford College in which he criticized the then ongoing American imperialist invasion of Iraq. His microphone was shut off 3 minutes after he began speaking. Chris had to end the commencement speech short because of the disruptions, which included an additional microphone cut, foghorns, and chants of God Bless America.
With angry crowds that leave scores of Iraqi
The New York Times criticized Chris's statements and issued him a formal reprimand for, quote, public remarks that could undermine public trust in the paper's impartiality, end quote. Following this, Chris resigned from the Times in 2005. Clearly, we are in a completely different period. Student anti-war protest movements are raging. In fact, when Chris was speaking on the megaphone at the campus anti-war protest at Princeton University last month, when the campus police and administration prevented him from speaking, the students chanted, "Let him speak, let him speak."
The reaction of the university is atrocious. It's overreaction. This is a peaceful, nonviolent protest.
On November 3rd, 2011, Chris was arrested with others at New York City's Occupy Wall Street demonstration, during which the activists staged a people's hearing on the activities of the investment bank Goldman Sachs and blocked the entrance to the corporate headquarters. Chris has long spoken out against the two warmongering parties of the United States, the Democrats and Republicans, and called for a new party for working people. In the 2008 United States presidential election, Chris was a speechwriter for Green Party candidate Ralph Nader. Chris also supported Green Party candidate Jill Stein against the Democrats and Wall Street's candidate Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election.
Before we hear from Chris, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you know that we bring coverage, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. As Kshama said, we've talked about how working people in the anti-war movement simply cannot afford to vote for Biden or Trump, or RFK Jr., that we need the strongest independent left anti-war vote possible for Jill Stein or Cornel West as a step towards building a new party for working people. If you haven't watched that interview yet, you should definitely check it out. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement, and that On Strike can continue to bring the kind of discussions about strategy for our movements that is crucial to being able to fight back and win. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. After you watch the interview, stick around to hear about next steps, including our announcement of a national student and campus workers Zoom meeting Workers Strike Back is organizing for Sunday, May 19th, so that we can discuss how to continue escalating the campus anti-war movement with mass protests at the DNC in August, and what we think campus unions can do and should be doing to support this historic fight. And now, Chris Hedges will be joining us from Princeton. Welcome to On Strike, Chris.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about your view of the war on Gaza and Biden and the U.S. ruling class's total complicity, not just in this current genocidal war, but also the decades-long brutal occupation?
Well, Israel is a settler colonial state. Its long history with the Palestinians replicates the trajectory of other settler colonial states, whether that's the British in India, the British in Kenya, the French in Algeria. The tactics are the same. The rhetoric is the same. The escalating violence is the same. From the inception of the state of Israel, it has been, we know that from private correspondence, from Ben Gurion and others, the intent to seize more and more land. In 1948, the so-called War of Independence, Israel seized violently 78% of historic Palestine. And then in 1967, in the so-called 67 War, it seized the remaining 22%, including, of course, Gaza and the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem. There's been moments of massive ethnic cleansing. 750,000 Palestinians were pushed out in 1948, the so-called Nakba, or catastrophe. And then about 300,000 were pushed out, expelled from their homes in 1967. But in the intervening years, there's been a slow-motion ethnic cleansing. All sorts of tactics have been used to suppress Palestinian resistance. The Oslo Peace Agreement is a very key moment because I think it was at that moment, I was there, I covered it, that the Palestinians realized that they were never going to be granted a state of their own. Israeli supporters like to say that the Palestinians were granted, 97% of the land. What they don't tell you is that Israel would control all of the borders, in effect perpetuating the siege that characterizes the West Bank and has characterized in a more draconian form life in Gaza, especially since the election of Hamas. So that what we're seeing now with the genocide in Gaza is a kind of denouement of this settler colonial project. There were periodic military assaults against Gaza, including the peaceful March of Return. Thousands of Palestinians were wounded and killed. And then what we saw on October 7th was essentially armed Palestinians breaking out of their concentration camp. I don't know any other word but that, open-air prison, and admittedly carrying out atrocities. But those of us, I spent 7 years reporting from Gaza, those of us who reported from Gaza kept writing over and over and over, you can't keep treating people like human animals with this kind of cruelty, this kind of violence, this kind of humiliation. There will be blowback. And so the evil that Israel visited on the Palestinians was the evil it got. Israel's response was to use the attacks of October 7th to essentially make war not on Hamas, but on the Palestinian people itself, to decimate all of Gaza and make it uninhabitable. We are now, of course, seeing the complete destruction, almost complete destruction of its medical facilities. The water purification plants, processing plants have been destroyed, so the water is fetid and poisoned. They are blocking food shipments, so there is increasing starvation, and they have made the Palestinians move around from one place to another 6, 7, 8 times. They've had to move. They're now being pushed out of Rafah because there's an assault on Rafah. The goal is clear. That is to create a humanitarian catastrophe of such catastrophic proportions that the only choice for the Palestinians is death or deportation. The role of the United States remains the role that it has traditionally played. It provides the weapons, in particular, that Israel allows Israel to carry out the occupation. In this case, of course, carry out the genocide. I think 68% of munitions come from the United States. That's not been halted. They include 2,000-pound precision-guided bunker buster bombs that Israel will drop on refugee camps. So the United States is certainly a full partner in this genocide. It knows very well what Israel's intent is. And when Israel finishes with Gaza, there are pretty clear signs that there are significant elements within the Netanyahu government that want to do the same thing in the West Bank.
Thank you so much, Chris. Just following up on one note that you touched on, the justification by the Israeli government for their really ongoing brutal policy against the Palestinians, and particularly Gaza, has been that it's necessary to have this kind of brutal military occupation and then obviously, really disproportionate retaliation in order to keep Israelis safe, right? That's the justification, that this policy is necessary to prevent violence against ordinary Israelis and to keep the Israeli working class safe. What do you think about that claim? Is this policy by the Israeli government actually keeping ordinary working class Israelis safer?
No, and I think October 7th is an illustration of how the policies have been a complete failure. The attempt to essentially violently crush Palestinian aspirations has had, not surprisingly, blowback. That's what October 7th was. And what we're seeing now with this wholesale decimation of Gaza is the re-traumatization of an entire generation of Palestinians who have lost parents, brothers, sisters, and of course, how would anyone expect them to respond? So the tactics that Israel has pursued by essentially trying to use coercive measures to thwart Palestinian aspirations for freedom and dignity and independence have not worked, and in fact have created situations that have become more and more extreme and more dangerous, and Israel has learned nothing from that. So no, the only way to keep Israeli workers safe is to create an equitable state where Palestinians have equal rights, one person, one vote, and end the occupation. That is the only, if anybody wants to speak about a world of safety, that's the only route.
I think that's a very important point you're making about why there is no safety or harmony for Israeli working class people, let alone their living standards being raised, because we know that there is poverty on both sides of the border, without actually having an end to the occupation. And that itself is not possible in our view as socialists without an overthrowing of capitalism internationally. And in fact, what we are calling for and what we think is the only thing that can work is for us to have an international working class movement against capitalism. So, as you said, in terms of, what can actually free the Palestinian people and also provide a solution for the Israeli working class people is to have a socialist Palestine and a socialist Israel as part of a voluntary socialist Middle East federation. And all of this, of course, at this moment, in the more immediate sense, points towards a global anti-war movement, first of all, to end the war, and U.S. military funding, all U.S. military funding for the Israeli state. And then, really linking that immediate immediate fight to the questions of the need to break from capitalism itself. In fact, you highlighted the role of American imperialism. This war would not be possible without American imperialism and the capitalist class as a whole backing it. It's also important to note that this goal of ending the war and having socialism and actually emancipating working people is not going to be possible on the basis of acts of terrorism either. If you look at the background of Hamas and how it does not provide any avenue forward for working people, Hamas is also an anti-working class, anti-strike kind of entity. And ultimately, we cannot put our faith, working people cannot put our faith in those kinds of reactionary forces. And instead, we need this kind of, actual uprising of the working class people, starting with the global anti-war movement. And, we know that the project of global imperialism and capitalism relies on all kinds of tools, and one of those tools is the media. And we already know that the New York Times, which pretends to objectivity, and the Washington Post, I mean, these are essentially mouthpieces of American imperialism. But then even seemingly independent media, you see the challenges when people actually speak out against the war. So can you tell us, in relation to this, how your views on this war have led to your show being cut from the Real News Network?
Yeah, let me first address that point about socialism, because when I first moved to Jerusalem in 1988, they were dismantling Historut, the socialist programs that had been put in place by the early Zionists for Israeli Jews. Israel now has one of the worst income inequalities in the world, has created its own form of the billionaire class. And I don't think that's tangential to the rise of this kind of proto-fascist Israeli government led by Netanyahu. I think it's linked to that economic inequality and the destruction of social welfare programs that once characterized the Israeli state, although Israel still does have universal health care. Well, I mean, there's just less and less space within the media landscape to raise uncomfortable questions about foreign policy in the case of supporting the Israeli apartheid state or challenging the two-party corporate duopoly that has put a stranglehold on the United States. And that, of course, saw my own show on the Real News canceled. I had interviewed Dennis Kucinich, former mayor of Cleveland, former member of the House, who is running in Ohio for a House seat, but he's running as an independent. He's not running as a Democrat or a Republican. The primary funder of the Real News is a guy named T.M. Scruggs, and he delivered an ultimatum to the Real News, according to Max Alvarez, the editor of the Real News, that if the Real News did anything, in his eyes, that contributed to the election of Donald Trump, their funding would be cut, and they don't really have much other funding. That's just an inverted way of saying you have to elect Joe Biden and the Democrats. And I think the press, unfortunately, because of the specter of Trump, has seen its mission as one whereby to quote unquote save our democracy, they must defeat Trump and elect a Democrat. And this has corrupted or corroded the credibility of the press even further than it already has. I mean, let's look at the New York Times. You had they sold the lie of weapons of mass destruction. They spent 2 years slogging the fiction that Donald Trump was a Russian agent. They published or put out a podcast called The Caliphate that was based on the testimony of someone who turned out to be a con artist, claimed he'd been a member of ISIS, completely fabricated. They recently published this bogus story about systematic rape, completely unverified. So the press, and you look at the poll numbers, has an approval rating or about as low as Congress, with good reason. And essentially it has refused to challenge the real center of power, which is corporate power. Why? Well, because that's who funds them. In many cases, that's who owns them. And so you have alternative media platforms, but even these have been seized. Sawant, for instance, which was founded by David Talbot, a great journalist, independent, gets bought up by some hedge fund manager. Alternate, the Real News, of course, essentially being dominated by its donor, T.M. Scruggs. So at the same time, the legacy media is in steep decline, not only in terms of its impact and its credibility, but commercially. It's just not pulling in the kind of money through advertising that it once was able to do. That's why big regional newspapers, Philadelphia Inquirer, Boston Globe, etc., have atrophied. They're just a ghost of a specter of what they once were. At the same time, you've seen alternative media collapse because those who set out with such good intentions, I think, sold them out. So, for money, they sold it. and it just got destroyed. So yeah, there's less and less place for independent journalism. That's why I went to Substack, which is a subscriber-based publication. People send in $6 a month. That's where Matt Taibbi went. That's where Glenn Greenwald went. And remember that with myself, Matt, Glenn, we were a decade ago part of the mainstream. We may have not been embraced by the mainstream, but we were given a voice or a platform, and that's all gone. So the walls are closing in, and there are forces, including the Democratic Party, that are quite happy to see these walls close in because they don't have any real answer to the distress that the working class is under or the crimes that are being committed, the act of genocide in Gaza. It's about censorship. It's about demonization of those who call them out. We have seen the student, very courageous student activists accused of being anti-Semites. I've been in the encampments in Columbia and in Princeton. I would say 30–40% of the protesters are Jewish. In fact, they hold Shabbat services in those encampments. The fabrication of threats or putting the safety of Jewish students in jeopardy is completely bogus. But it's a way to deflect attention from the actual issue, which is not only genocide, but the complicity of these institutions in investing in companies, defense companies, Israeli companies that profit from this genocide. And the press has been, my old employer, the New York Times, has been awful. The press has amplified these canards. And that's why when you walk in these encampments, there is a great deal of anger, even rage, at organs like CNN or the New York Times. And I would say that rage is completely justified.
Absolutely. I think even the corporate media has been forced to note that the ongoing campus anti-war protests are the most politically significant since 1968, which of course was the height of the historic anti-Vietnam War movement. I'm curious if you agree with that assessment, and also what do you think the next steps for continuing to escalate that movement should be? Of course, we're facing the end of the academic year here coming up very soon. And I think it's really essential for the current momentum that the student anti-war movement has to not just kind of be cut off when the school year ends, but to have sort of a clear next step or a point in the future, a goal that we can focus on to keep building momentum. And what do you think about the proposal that Workers Strike Back has made for that protest movement to focus on the DNC and try to mobilize mass numbers of students and campus workers and working people to the DNC in August?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and if I can, I'll be there. We should all be in Chicago. But the Columbia students who occupied Hamilton Hall, renaming it Hind Hall, or Hind Hall after the little 6-year-old girl who was murdered by the Israelis, and then evicted by NYPD police who entered the building with their guns drawn. In fact, one of the police officers fired the gun, beat the students. One of them was thrown downstairs and beaten unconscious. Their encampment was eradicated, and their response has been in the fall to begin to organize a general strike of staff, students, and professors to shut the universities down. I think what we have to understand that it's not the students who are escalating, it's the administrations that are escalating, because these protests began shortly after October 7th, and there were repeated calls for dialogue, discussions about divesting, about severing ties with Israeli companies, Israeli universities, and they were just ignored. The students were met with a wall of silence. Finally, the encampments went up. Those encampments were, I just came actually from Princeton University, and there are signs and police all around the encampment saying that it has to be shut down today. And if they don't shut it down today, everyone will be arrested. So they eradicate the encampments. They empty the occupied halls like Hamilton Hall. Over 100 Columbia students were arrested. The students, 13 students who occupied Clio Hall at Princeton were all arrested. They're banned from the campus. I mean, Columbia University is under police occupation. There's no other way to put it. There are NYPD police all over the campus, and all of the entrances to the center of the campus are blocked off by private security and police. And the only way you can get in is if you live in a residence hall on the campus. A lot of students don't, and they can't get to class. They can't do their lab work. They can't go to the library. So the university is, in essence, occupied by the police. So yeah, the game of escalation has been perpetrated by the university administrators, and the response on the part of the students has been to escalate back. And so that's what Columbia students are calling for. When the university shuts down one tactic, they will move to another. I think in the short term, yes, we've got to go to Chicago to put pressure on Biden. That's the only pressure, by the way, they feel. They don't really care. They're utterly indifferent to voters. But in fact, they care quite a bit about these protests, which have spooked them, as they should. And so we have to continue them. I think one of the things that's been moving, I, of course, covered the Middle East for a long time, covered Gaza for a long time, and so have friends in Gaza, one of whom was killed, and several of whom are missing for weeks. There's been no contact. I assume they're probably buried under the rubble, is the staying power of these protests, not only in terms of the duration, but also in terms of the numbers. That's been very, very heartening. I don't think it's going to go away. And I don't think it's going to go away because this is really an issue that extends beyond Gaza. What these students are protesting is a world where the industrial North essentially carries out egregious acts of wholesale violence and ignores any kind of international law or humanitarian law. And as the climate crisis worsens, as mass migrations become ever more frequent, as droughts and wildfires and flooding and lowering crop yields make life in the global South harder and harder to sustain, the message of the genocide in Gaza is that this will be the response of the climate fortresses the global North is building. I think that's clear. And that's why there is such support for the Palestinians in the global South. And then also the historical memory of, I don't think it's accidental, for instance, that Yemen is the one country that's actively intervening to stop the genocide. Yemen suffered 30,000 cases of death by starvation, cholera epidemics under the U.S.-Saudi siege. So it's all within recent memory, but within historical memory in South Africa, it's at the apartheid state of South Africa, in India. This is how settler colonial projects worked. And people who have lived in countries that had been colonized understand, they know what they're seeing. So I think that this movement is actually far more pervasive than the narrow issue of Gaza itself. And that's why I think it's not going away. I will just also say, having spent a lot of time in the Occupy movement, the response of the Obama administration was to eradicate the Occupy encampments around the country in a coordinated national effort. They went in and swept them away. And that made it very hard in places like New York to rebuild a movement because there was a physical location in which the movement could be rebuilt. Well, that's not the case on the university campuses. These students are going back to that physical location. And the power of numbers means they have the capacity to control what happens on that physical location. And so you have seen essentially a replica of the state tactics that were used against Occupy, used against these university protests, but it's a different phenomenon. I mean, Columbia University hired this guy, Kaz Holloway. He was the deputy mayor under Bloomberg. He was in charge of destroying the encampment at Zuccotti Park. I mean, that's the kind of expertise they want. And then just to finish, these universities also replicate that corporate model. You have Shafiq, the president of Columbia, was not an academic, not a scholar. She comes out of the world of finance. These administrators pull down hundreds of thousands of dollars. They come out of the corporate world. And then in many universities, most of the teaching load, for instance, at Rutgers, where I've taught, is carried by adjuncts who make next to nothing. They're lucky if they make $24,000, $25,000 a year without benefits or job security. So the universities themselves have become corporatized in how they work and how they think. And any corporate structure is totalitarian in nature. It is completely hierarchical. You're not allowed to challenge it, or you are pushed out of the structure. And that, of course, is what they have done to these universities and why they have responded the way they have.
I think you're absolutely right, Chris, that it's been really, as you said, hardening and really an important feature of the period that this anti-war movement has shown such staying power. And it's really important to note, and this is where the comparison with 1968 goes, which is that it's in a presidential election year with a Democrat in the White House that these movements have been emerging, not to mention also the labor uprising that is ongoing since, especially since the last 2 years. There is real anger among the younger generation, especially against not only the war, but the brutal occupation. But as you said correctly, it is about the anger overall that tens of millions of people are feeling in America against the system itself, against oppression, against climate catastrophe, and as you mentioned, against the corporatization of education and even public education. And I just wanted to share with our viewers, as some of you might know, that among the demands that we are calling for this anti-war movement, especially as we head towards the DNC and as the campuses go into their summer break, is in order to really build a strategy to carry that movement forward beyond the campus encampment. We're also calling for labor unions to rescind their Biden endorsements, and also that we need to fight for an end to the war, an end to U.S. military funding for the Israeli state, and instead to fund free 4-year college education for all. And I think that really speaks to the anger that young people feel about what's happening in education, including especially in public education. And we'll definitely be there. Kaylin and I will be there at the DNC, and we hope to see you there. In fact, Worker Strike Back is going to be hosting hopefully a big rally there, and we definitely want you to speak there alongside us. And on that note, we know that the Democratic Party has often attempted to pose as an anti-war party, but of course it's completely belied by the fact that Biden is the warmonger in chief at this moment. And you mentioned how he's shamefully calling the campus protest anti-Semitic, and all of this shows that the reality is completely the opposite. That the Democrats are one of the two warmongering parties of the U.S. billionaire class and U.S. imperialism. And also we've seen the development of the uncommitted movement, where people are actually saying, these are people who have voted Democrat maybe many times, who are saying that I'm so angry against the war, I'm angry at the cost of living crisis, I'm angry at the fact that Biden was the guy who took away COVID-era benefits, especially including child tax credit, which really helped to slash the poverty rate. And now, since the child tax credits have been taken back by Biden, the poverty rate again has shot up for families with young children. And in the midst of all this, people have been saying in the primaries that we don't want to vote for Biden or Trump. However, we know that a lot of this will come up against a ferocious effort towards lesser evilism, telling people that, well, if you're against the war, how can you vote for Trump? You need to vote for Biden, because if Trump comes, if you have Trump 2.0, then it's going to be worse. And of course, we have been very clear that Trump 2.0 will be horrific, not only in terms of imperialist war, but in terms of the promises he has already made in an ominous manner to go after the left, to go after the LGBTQ and trans community. And so we don't believe that we can minimize the dangers of the rise of Trumpism, but we also absolutely reject lesser evilism, because we know that the Democrats have been the best builders of Trumpism and right-wing populism. And you mentioned Obama, and Obama's betrayals towards the working class, including the troop surge in Afghanistan, ended up giving the opening for the right-wing Tea Party movement. So in the midst of all this, as people head to November, as people are confronted with repeated onslaught of lesser evilism, what do you think people should do in the presidential election?
Well, as you mentioned, I worked with Ralph Nader, and Ralph understands corporate power probably better than anyone in the United States. He's been fighting it his whole life. And he saw how essentially the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was decimated by corporate forces. He wrote and pushed through 24 pieces of legislation through that liberal wing, the Mine and Safety Act, OSHA, etc., Clean Water Act, Clean Air. This all came out of Nader. And then finally, there was no one left. And so he mounted a presidential campaign. And his argument was, if we can pull 10, 15, 20 million people, that's the only way we can put pressure on the Democratic Party not to essentially serve its corporate masters, which became especially the case after the Clinton presidency. Clinton essentially turned the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. Joe Biden's voting record is essentially Republican, and it pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. The problem is we didn't stand up after NAFTA. We should have never voted for a Democrat. We didn't use the power we have, the power of numbers. I can't vote for Joe Biden. In the end, genocide's not a political issue. It's a moral issue. They're the ones who did this to the country. Why? Because they wouldn't hold power without corporate money. The Hillary Clinton or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden, they wouldn't exist as political figures. I mean, even in the primaries, the Democratic establishment had to pressure everyone else to drop out because nobody wanted Biden. They're the ones who are doing this to the country. And why? Because they don't want to lose their first-class seats. They don't want to lose their positions by antagonizing their corporate funders, the people who make their political careers possible. They are creatures of corporate power, and they serve their masters. And they're the ones who have distorted and destroyed our democracy. And I've written numerous books about it: Death of the Liberal Class, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, America, the Farewell Tour. They're the ones who betrayed the working class. 30 million American workers losing their jobs since 1996, when figures were first recorded in mass layoffs. That's the engine behind a figure like Trump. It's rage, and it's a legitimate rage. And for us to, the quote-unquote liberal class, to go around and scold a dispossessed working class that they're not grateful, that they're not showing enough gratitude to the Democrats, is insane. And so the problem is, by not standing unequivocally with a dispossessed working class, with the working poor, against these forces, in the long term, we have no credibility. And that's why the liberal class and the Democratic Party has no credibility. In fact, of course, it's fused with the old establishment wing of the Republican Party, Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and others, just to become one big ruling party against Trump's white man's party. But they're the ones who destroyed our democracy and our economy and our the social programs, and pushed through austerity and orchestrated the DN. They did that, and we're not responsible for that. We're responsible for standing up against that. As painful in the short term it's going to be, because like you, I do fear a Trump presidency, but there's no way I'm voting for Biden.
And actually, on that question of how, if we really want to have an end to the war on Gaza, if we want working class people to actually win even the most basic of their needs satisfied, like free healthcare for all, free college education, free childcare, all of this, then none of this is going to be possible as long as we are tied to the Democratic and Republican parties, and that we need a new party. Concretely, this year, in terms of November, what people should be doing for the presidential election, do you agree with our position that we should be urging working people to fight for the largest possible vote for the left anti-war candidates, Jill Stein and Cornel West, not with some sort of illusion that either of them is going to win, because we know that won't happen, but to provide a concrete alternative to Biden and Trump and the warmongering parties of the billionaire class, and as a step towards actually building a new working class party?
Yes, of course. And, this is the problem with Bernie Sanders. So Bernie raised a lot of money. There were a lot of issues with Bernie that I agreed on, but you don't create a political revolution in an election cycle. And you certainly don't create a political revolution telling your supporters after Hillary Clinton is the nominee that they should vote for Hillary Clinton. So that was the great failing, I think, Bernie's failing. Building movements like this takes time. Syriza was polling in the single digits. A decade later, they controlled the government. I mean, they were assaulted. That's another story, by the European banking system and everything else. But it takes time. It's a long process, but it requires us to step out and challenge the system. Politics is a game of fear. They will respond to fear. Most of the social reforms that were pushed through came through third-party movements. The socialists, the Communist Party, which we've kind of written out of our history, very important force in the 1930s, the Progressive Party, everything else. A segment of the society has to stand firmly behind the issues that it believes in and cares about, because without it, there is no pressure. All the pressure comes from Goldman Sachs and Halliburton and Chevron and everyone else. So it's uncomfortable, it's dangerous to a certain extent politically. It's frightening because Trump is frightening, but it's time to stand up. And if we don't stand up, then there isn't going to be anything left. There's not much left of our anemic democracy as it is, but it's going to get completely snuffed out. We have the power of the strike. That is the power throughout history. It's why both the Democrats and the Republican parties have worked so hard to make it to de-unionize. Only, 11%, I think, of American workers are unionized, and I think only 6% in the private sector. But that has been long the goal since the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. That is the power we have. If we can regain that power on a nationwide level, we can bring any government to its knees.
Absolutely agree. I think the student, as you were alluding to, the student movement and the protest movement are absolutely crucial, and they have to be linked to a concrete strategy for November in terms of voting for Jill Stein or Cornel West as an actual way of breaking away from Biden and Trump. And you're also right, Chris, as you were saying, that if you look at how Canada or European countries have won major reforms like free healthcare for all, they were done actually by third parties or independent parties or working class led parties. And as you correctly mentioned, many of these efforts were precisely because these parties, the formation of these parties and the labor movement and the militancy in the labor movement that led to the formation of these parties, all of this was actually led by a real development of socialist and, as you said, communist consciousness in those countries. And in fact, those reforms were wrested out of the hands of the capitalist class because they actually feared revolution. And all of this points to also the very important point you made, which is the reason that Bernie Sanders not only failed in 2016 and 2020, but also now at this point, he has completely betrayed the working class. He has given such shameful cover to Biden and the Democrats. And I just wanted to say, it reminds me, I don't know if you remember, Chris, you and I spoke alongside each other, and also Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, and Bernie Sanders the night before the People's Climate March in September 2014 in Manhattan, where you and I strongly agreed that we need an independent working class representation, and that for Bernie to call for a political revolution against the billionaire class from inside the party of the billionaire class was not going to be possible. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about what do you think has happened to Bernie Sanders and the squad, and do you think that working people should have illusions in either of them?
Well, remember, Kshama, his answer was, I don't want to end up like Ralph Nader. I don't want to become a pariah. I mean, remember, he may run as an independent. He caucuses with the Democratic Party. He is awarded his chairmanships on committees through the Democratic Party. And it was essentially a statement that I don't want to risk my career the way Nader did. That was his answer. And of course, the squad, in particular AOC, they've all been domesticated. They won't stand up at the risk of their own careers. And that, of course, is deadly. If you don't stand on principle, and if you're not willing to accept the cost, then, and of course there are going to be many of us who are pushed aside, we're not going to achieve anything. And these powerful corporate indentured parties have lots of ways of intimidating figures who may go into political life with a certain amount of idealism, such as AOC or Sanders. But in essence, they turn them into lapdogs, and that's what we have to. We have to regain a kind of militancy. We have to make them afraid of us instead of us being afraid of them.
Absolutely. So, Chris, we've been talking a lot about, U.S. capitalism's role, that they're playing right now in financially, militarily, politically supporting Israel's war on Gaza. But of course, this isn't the only war right now that the U.S. government is invested in to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars. There's also the war in Ukraine. And you've spoken out against Putin and Russian imperialism's invasion of Ukraine in March 2022. You condemned Russia's aggression as criminal, and you also criticized NATO's expansion as a dangerous and predictable provocation that baited Russia to initiate this conflict. You called for Russia's withdrawal, for an immediate ceasefire and moratorium on arms shipments to Ukraine. And you also criticized the $40 billion aid package for Ukraine in a May 2022 piece, which you said demonstrates that the United States is trapped in a death spiral of unchecked militarism as the country, quote, rots morally, politically, economically, and physically, end quote, with no real plan to address the epidemic of mass shootings, decaying infrastructure, lack of universal health care, ever-rising inequality, student debt, child poverty, and the opioid epidemic. So what is your view now at this point of the war? We, of course, also condemn Putin's invasion, as you know, and we also think that this is in reality an inter-imperialist conflict that does not represent the interests of the working class in Ukraine, Russia, or working people anywhere, including in the U.S. And we agree with you in opposing U.S. military funding to Ukraine. We think an end to this war, as in Gaza, requires building a global anti-war movement, and that working people in both Ukraine and Russia and around the world need to be part of that anti-war movement and build links between the working classes of different countries to rise up against the ruling class in Ukraine, in Russia, and around the world. So again, at this stage in the war, what are your thoughts on how it's played out?
Well, it's the slaughter of the Russian working class and the Ukrainian working class for the interests of largely the United States, which is funding the proxy war. The proxy war is aimed at isolating Putin, in particular in Europe, and degrading the Russian military. It has been evidence from the beginning of the war that Ukrainian victory over much larger Russian forces in a war of attrition was impossible. There would always have to be an exchange of land for peace. Even the dreaded Henry Kissinger said this at the inception of the conflict. But the aims and interests of the imperial powers are not the same aims and interests of Ukraine. That's always true in proxy wars. I covered many of them around the globe. So it's very cynical. They will see Ukraine destroyed. They will see Ukraine society decimated. I think the average age now in Ukraine of the soldiers is 43. So the intent of the war was never to push Russia completely. They're not leaving the Donbass and the Crimea. These are areas that historically, going back over a century, have been in essence ethnically Russian. But that was not the aim of the war. It was a proxy war, and it enriched the arms manufacturers and achieved to a certain extent the ends that Washington wanted, which is Putin is isolated from the rest of Europe as they wanted. And of course, ironically, it's pushed him closer to China, which is not in their interest. So yeah, it's a very, very cynical proxy war that will end with a negotiated settlement. And that negotiated settlement could have been achieved before the war began. And I covered Eastern Europe in '89. I was in East Germany and was there for the fall of the Berlin Wall and was there for the promises that were made to Gorbachev that NATO would not be extended beyond the borders of a unified Germany. And of course, they lied because the arms manufacturers wanted to make billions, which they did, reconfiguring former Warsaw Pact countries to be compatible with NATO military equipment, and then also the hubris of the United States. If you remember, was talking about a multipolar world. Russia, Moscow, whether it was Yeltsin, Gorbachev, or Putin, all kept saying, stop, stop, stop. We can't have a NATO country like Ukraine on our border with missiles. And we ignored them. And we knew exactly what, there was actually a WikiLeaks released a cable from William Burns when he was the ambassador in Russia. He's now the head of the CIA, said that this is not a debatable issue within Russia in terms of turning Ukraine into a NATO country. That across the political spectrum, people see this as a threat. I mean, historically, Russia was invaded twice in the last century, in the First World War and the Second World War, through Ukraine. So, yeah, it was a completely unnecessary war. It should have never happened. We bear tremendous responsibility for it. That does not finally absolve Russia for carrying it out, but they were pushed and pushed and pushed. And yeah, that's the tragedy of Ukraine. I mean, who comes out as usual? The only people who profited in a very literal sense from this conflict are the people who make the weapons.
Yeah, those are all very important points. I think it's important that we talk about that, as well as the correct focus on the war in Gaza. And as I said before, we'd like to have you back on the show to talk about many other things that we don't have time for today, including the climate catastrophe, the U.S. prison system, your work with the incarcerated people, and also your book that you wrote on that, your new book. So we'd love to have you back to talk about all that. But for today, thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thank you, Kshama.
As we mentioned at the top of the show, Workers Strike Back is hosting a national Zoom meeting for students and campus workers on May 19th at noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern, to talk about how to continue building the momentum of the campus anti-war movement with a nationally coordinated mass protest at the DNC in Chicago in August, and by sharing lessons from campus unions that have passed resolutions and strike authorizations in solidarity with the student protests and against police repression. We also need the rank and file of the labor movement to put forward resolutions to rescind their unions' endorsements of Biden. Campus unions should provide a lead to the anti-war movement by calling for a one-day nationwide strike and walkout against the war. This is what it will take to end the war, shutting down the profits of the capitalists. If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working-class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working-class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working-class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to our On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video, and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.